Welcome back to another episode of the Victory Over Vices podcast, brought to you commercial-free by addictionhelp.com. I am your host, Dan Hauser, and on this episode, we're going to take a look at the correlation between injuries and long-term mental health and substance abuse issues in athletes. Let's get into the show. All right, so for those of us that watch sports, especially football, it's pretty commonplace. An athlete goes down with an injury during a game. In football, especially, it happens on almost every single play. And while every time it might not necessarily be the quote-unquote big one, it happens. And it happens in all sports. Think about it from this standpoint. A basketball player goes up for a jump shot, lands awkwardly on his ankle. A pitcher throws, what seemingly is a standard pitch to you and I, tweaks something in his arm. In fact, it happens so often that I think we've actually kind of as sports fans grown accustomed to it. Once again, I bring up football again because in football it happens on almost every single play, and unless it is such a significant injury that the game has to stop for a while, or somebody has to be carted off the field, or God forbid loaded it up in an ambulance, us and to an extent the players and coaches, I don't really think they think much of it. It's just kind of like, all right, that guy goes off the field, the next one comes on, the game resumes. And so, for generations on top of that, it was always about, all right, we got to get the guy back in the game quickly. And so whether it was, a Toradol shot, painkillers, smelling salts, anything that they could do, it was, what can we do to get the guy back into the game quickly? And for the player, it was, okay, what do I need to do, or what can I do to get back in the game quickly? Because once again, I keep bringing up football, but especially in football, one injury and you miss one game, and that could potentially be the end of your career if your backup comes in and plays really well. Just ask Drew Bledsoe and Tom Brady. If it wasn't for Drew Bledsoe's injury and having to miss several games, who knows if Tom Brady ever would have become a thing. Tom Brady might have just spent his entire career as a backup in New England or bounced around as a backup in other teams. And because Drew Bledsoe got hurt, Tom Brady became Tom Brady. Unfortunately, what we don't often see, though, is that those quick fixes, they work in real time. They work in the interim. They wrap an ankle up. The guy takes a painkiller, he takes a shot, and even if he's not necessarily back out there that game, he's back out there the next week. And you think about some of these injuries, specifically in football and in hockey, and you hear what the injury is, and you think to yourself, if that were me, I wouldn't be able to walk, let alone play in a game again for weeks or even months. And these guys are back at it, 3, 4, 5, 6 days later. And so while it may be great for us as fans and it may be great for the player in the interim, we've also been learning that long-term, these quick fixes can have significant and severe impacts on these players' well-being and livelihood long after they've retired and long after they have re-entered society and just tried to be normal parents, husbands, human beings at that point. And so unfortunately for many of these athletes, these injuries linger for long periods of time. There's not really a way for them to heal themselves because they have gotten so bad that they're beyond repair. And so athletes then find themselves having to constantly take painkillers. Many of them turn to alcohol. They do whatever they can do to try to just numb the pain, both mentally and physically, even if it's just for a few minutes so they can try to feel better and feel normal. We've seen it so much. Athletes get into substance abuse problems. They get into addiction issues. Their mental health's not there. And, if you look at somebody like, say, a Junior Seau, and there's been so many, unfortunately, before and after him, they find no other ways to get rid of the pain than to just take their own lives. And so, it's truly unfortunate. And it got me thinking there's got to be another way for these athletes to treat these ailments, both in real time and long after they have retired. So when we come back, we are going to take a deeper dive into that with Dr. Harlan Austin, sports psychologist at Premier Sports Psychology, and try to see, get some of those answers and try to see if there's things that these athletes can be doing both now and later to help their overall quality of life. So we'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the show. I am joined once again by Dr. Harlan Austin, sports psychologist at Premier Sports Psychology. Dr. Harlan, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks. Happy to be here, Dan.
So we had a chance to kind of talk in the lead up to this episode, but the general theme, if you will, for the episode we're doing here is kind of how these injuries that athletes so commonly and often experience, how it affects them, not just physically, because we were able to kind of see how it affects them physically, but how it affects them mentally as well, particularly once they have stopped playing. And so right off the bat, if we already know that athletes' brains are kind of quote unquote wired differently, and they have to be in order to be able to play at the level they play at. What happens to the wiring, so to say, in their brain once an injury occurs in real time?
Yeah, it really depends on the type of injury somebody's going to experience on what happens within the brain. Because, in the most severe circumstances, we're going to actually have a trauma response, right? So we can have a traumatic injury and we can also have a run-of-the-mill injury. And there's a difference between the two, and psychologically what happens for any person, athletes included. So the traumatic injury is one in which, this is where you see they're going to bring out the EMS. They're going to bring out the training staff. Somebody gets carted off the field, and the severity of the injury is requiring them to essentially go straight to a hospital to get trauma treatment. And that could be anything from a neck injury, broken bone, severe torn ligaments, dislocations and things like that, or even TBIs, right, where somebody's lost consciousness because of a concussion, and TBI being traumatic brain injury. So the response of what's going to happen both from a physiological state in the brain and a psychological state in the brain is really going to depend on where are we on the spectrum of the severity of the injury. And so in the case of a traumatic injury, the way the brain is interpreting this is literally as a threat to my life or well-being. And in some cases, some injuries are a threat to one's life. And in those situations and scenarios, you actually may have somebody who's in a trauma response where they're going to black out. Essentially, they're not going to lay down memories the same way that they might normally lay down memories, because the brain's trying to protect itself. And if you talk with folks who are post-injury in one of those injuries that was really a nasty injury, thinking compound fracture, the bones sticking out of the leg, that type of thing, often people won't have a really clear line through memory of the whole situation. They just kind of have flashes. And that's partly because in a traumatic response, the brain's trying to protect somebody, right? So it's like kind of goes offline to not lay down all the memories because it's too much. It's overwhelming. And so that's kind of the extreme end of the spectrum of what's going to happen with the brain in those scenarios. And then the other end of the spectrum is you run in the mill injury, right? People roll an ankle, right? You don't need to be taken to the hospital for a sprained ankle, but it might take you out of a game, right? And so in those situations, the response is not going to be so traumatic, but it's certainly going to be one of frustration, right? You might see somebody go more towards that anger end of the spectrum because they want to compete, they want to continue to play, and they're angry about the fact that this happened. And so they can certainly, in that acute moment, feel real high levels of frustration. And, we've all seen the athlete who maybe limps off the field or the court, and you see that they're really angry. They're kind of throwing a towel, or, they're upset because they want to compete. And that's where we see, maybe if you think about the athlete population versus the normal population, maybe some different responses to injury. And I don't think anybody loves being injured, but if you just roll your ankle and you're not about to go compete at a high level on television, your anger level is probably not going to be as high. You're not going to be happy about the fact it happened, but somebody who's wanting to get back into a game, they're going to experience that level of anger because of that competitive drive that's there. And so there's a real frustration and an urgency to kind of get over this injury that might not be there for somebody who's not trying to physically compete to earn their paycheck.
So I think in football and in baseball, I feel like we see it more often than some of the other sports. But you think about, like, say, a pitcher, and he throws a pitch, and to you and I, or to the average person watching at home, it may look like a perfectly normal pitch. And he throws that pitch, and he immediately signals for the trainer to come out, or he walks up the mound, and he knows right away, I'm done. I'm out, that something bad just happened.
Yeah.
We see it a lot in football as well. What seems like a normal tackle or something happens, and you can see it on the athlete's face. And you mentioned, or the way they react, they might immediately know, yeah, I just tore my Achilles, or I just, something just happened in my knee just popped, something bad happened. And so, obviously there's a mental side of that. And also, of course, athletes, their bodies are so fine tuned. It's part of their job to know every little thing there and know immediately if something's not right. But, in that spot, when an athlete immediately goes, something happened, something's not right, even if they don't necessarily know what's not right yet, they know something isn't right. What is the brain telling them in that spot in order for them to immediately know, yeah, something's wrong here, something's not okay, I need to remove myself from the game?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that is helpful for us to understand that process is to understand the concept of multiple intelligences. So when we go to school, traditionally, we're trained in a reading, writing style, and there's lots of other styles of intelligence and learning that exist out there. And one of those is what we call a bodily kinesthetic intelligence. And this is where we see somebody who very much so understands their body, how to move their body, how their body fits and moves in space. And elite athletes, professional athletes, if you want to think of it in terms of genius, they end up having a genius level of that bodily kinesthetic intelligence. And so their relationship to their bodies is very different than the relationship to your average Joe's relationship. And so because of that awareness, because of that understanding, little bit of feedback about, like you said, a pop or something that doesn't feel right for them is going to be interpreted in a way where they understand, hey, that means I can't do XYZ behavior. That's a big deal. That's really important. And they're going to be very aware of that. Their body is especially at the professional level, like that is the thing that pays the bills. And so their relationship to their bodies, their understanding of their bodies does tend to be on that genius level, which if you don't have that, it's very hard to understand, right? If a math genius looks at a math equation in a certain way and you're not a math genius, we can't understand the way they look at that equation. And it's the same thing that happens with people who end up being the world's top most elite athletes. Their bodily kinesthetic intelligence is so high that small changes and things like that are very much so on their radar. They understand it, and then they can see 3 steps down the road how that impacts their ability to perform.
So on that note of kind of that intelligence level, particularly now, I feel like in the NBA, you look at the NBA, like load management has become this big thing. Now guys are just sitting out, even if they're not necessarily hurt, to kind of help prevent themselves and to keep their bodies well tuned for the entire season.
Yeah.
You look at, say, keeping on that NBA theme, you look at, say, the time when Michael Jordan was playing, that load management wasn't a thing. Guys were not sitting like that. And so during that time period, if you had a guy sitting like that, it would be viewed as, he's not a team player, or he's not committed, or he's soft, or he's weak, or whatever. And now I use the NBA as a specific example here, but I feel like in all sports, it's more and more accepted if an athlete just removes himself from the game if he knows that something isn't right. Is that a matter of kind of that intelligence you're referring to? Is that kind of a matter of us understanding more about that kind of intelligence, athletes becoming smarter when it comes to it, or why have we seen such a shift in recent years as far as athletes being more and more okay with just saying, yeah, I'm not playing today?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of levels to it. I think one of those is certainly having more of a voice as an athlete, and recognizing that if you're a professional athlete, you are your own business. And if we're talking about, let's just use that NBA example, you're your own business. And every year that you are able to maintain your career in the NBA is potentially another 10, 20, 30 more $1 million into your business. And any business CEO in the country, if they were given the choice, hey, could you choose to add 20, 30, $50 million to your business's net, would you take that? They're going to all say yes, and they're going to do whatever they can. And so having an understanding of self as business, as a professional athlete, very much so plays into this. And recognizing if I use some load management, and the understanding about load management, that comes from sports science, right? And so athletes aren't just creating the idea of, oh, hey, I think I'm going to do this differently so that I have a better likelihood of maintaining my health through the career. Like they're getting this information from sports scientists. They're being told, hey, let's look at your output. Let's look at how many minutes you're running. Let's look at over the course of the season what that looks like and what's going to be ideal for your body and what your body's capable of doing. So they're being coached essentially on this by their sports medicine staff that's around them. And so on the outside, it may look like the athlete just says, I don't want to play, but it is not that simple, right? There's a much more to that. These professional athletes have entire teams of sports medicine and sports scientists around them that are using real analytical data to inform the decisions they're making here. And the goal here is to, yes, prolong somebody's health throughout a season, and then perhaps even prolong somebody's career throughout a lifespan. And both of those things in the long run are about performance, right? It's about being able to perform at their best when they need to be at their best and perform at the highest level for the longest period of time that they can.
So unfortunately, a trend too that we see with some older athletes, the ones who may not have done what some of the new age athletes are doing as far as following the sports medicine and doing load management or whatnot, is they would play through injury so often, or they would just do the short term solution, whether it was a Toradol shot or taking this painkiller or smelling salt, whatever it was, to get back out there as quickly as possible. And while it was solving the issue in the short term, long term, it was causing much more severe and significant injury issues, post retirement and whatnot. In some cases, at the point where the damage was no longer repairable, and basically they just had to continue to keep living their lives with these painkillers so they could just operate, on a daily basis as a normal human being. And so, as is the case with really anyone who just is in a cycle where they keep having to just take these painkillers or turning to alcohol to try to numb the pain, you develop substance abuse issues, more significant mental health issues. First off, I guess it's a two-part question. One, in your opinion, why would they not address the issues sooner when it was still repairable? And also, two, is there still a chance for them to be able to help themselves, whether it be physically or mentally, or is there kind of a point of no return as far as these injuries do go?
I think that our ability to treat pain and to treat injuries is something that, from a medical science standpoint, is getting better every day, right? So research is there, new treatment abilities, things like stem cell therapy. So this is kind of towards the second part of your question. There are always going to be new and better medical technologies to help. And so I think it's important for folks to recognize that those are worth exploring. They're worth pursuing. And so I do believe that there are things that people can do differently than they have done historically to treat injuries that are essentially chronic in nature, right? And to kind of go to the first part of that question that you're referring to, athletes coming through any professional sport, but at the highest level, they're going to come out with a career that has resulted in bumps and bruises and surgeries and all kinds of stuff to their bodies. And quite often people will sacrifice their body when they're young so that they can make it at whatever make it means for whatever league they're in, but they want to make it and they're willing to make that sacrifice. And often that's coming from the mind of a 20-something-year-old. And it's very focused on the here and now, which is developmentally where 20-somethings minds are. They're looking at the here and now. They're not thinking about tomorrow. If you were to sit down and give them all the statistics about the potential long-term problems, they say, yeah, but that's not going to be me, right? And that's just how the 20-year-old mind works. So over the course of that career, as they do have to, experience the injuries, experience the potentially chronic nature of some of those injuries that they're going to have to deal with, it's not something that's in their decision making. And so, providing education is certainly valuable, but it's one of those things that ongoing education is really going to be important. So when somebody gets to, let's say they're retired at 35 from one of these professional sports, right? Now they've got a little bit better ability to think about the future and to plan. And this is where it's really key to address. Now, what have we been doing to treat these injuries? And because that's where you have maybe see some of these not so healthy ways about treating injury. Somebody who's maybe having a couple extra drinks, right, because it numbs the pain, or somebody who's taking as prescribed long-term opioid prescriptions, which we know evidence does not recommend, right? The evidence-based treatment for opioids is in a very acute, short-term, and then we switch over to non-habit forming type pain medications. But that has not been the practice. Certainly 10 years ago, it was not the practice. I think it's medical world is coming along with that. We're not doing long-term opioid prescriptions the way they once did. But a lot of education is important for folks to recognize that there are things we can do to treat pain. Sometimes chronic injuries are going to be around for a lifetime, right? If you ever go to one of these, NFL, like retirement kind of parties, or if you watch the crowd walk in and out at the Hall of Fame, and it's somebody, and you see a bunch of men who are giants, but maybe they're only in their 50s, but they're limping and they're wearing knee braces and they've got canes, and that's from this 20 years or of their life when they were a kid in college and professional sports where they were using their bodies in a really violent way. And it does not come without a price. That is for sure.
So unfortunately, another price that we have seen, and the name Junior Seau comes to mind when I think about where we're going with this particular topic. And this is not exclusive to athletes, obviously. Unfortunately, there are many regular people out there that also find no other option out there than to unfortunately take their own lives. But when you look at somebody like a Junior Seau, or unfortunately other athletes that has happened with, whether it be the physical pain or the mental pain or both, I guess the question would be what goes through the mind of someone at that point, and where do they have to be almost to say to themselves, I don't see any other solution here than to no longer be living? Because it to you, to say it to somebody who has not experienced that mental anguish, it would be like saying, like, there's got to be another way. This can't be the only option. I mean, you're living or you're not living, but unfortunately, obviously, there comes a point to somebody, and we've seen it with these athletes where they say to themselves, my only option here is to take my own life. How does that kind of play out as far as the brain goes?
Yeah, well, it's a very complicated question, and it's a complicated answer because, no two people's brains are the same. But if we were to look at what we've seen with folks who have had post-mortem diagnosis of CTE, which is this brain disease that happens after chronic concussions and multiple brain injuries, we have an understanding that there certainly seems to be a depression component for folks who have CTE. And again, unfortunately, we can only diagnose this post-mortem. So we can see signs and symptoms ahead of time, but the diagnosis at this point is one of those things that you see people who are donating their brain after they die because they know they've been suffering from symptoms. And so if we look at some of the things that have been associated with this, depressed mood, also mood instability, impulsive behaviors, what we see is a brain that's not functioning in a normal way. And so if we were to think about it like a computer or an engine, it's not working the way that it normally works. And so there's certain types of misfires, or there's not enough of a certain type of fuel to run the system. And when that happens, from the outside, it's very hard to understand what that experience is like from the inside for the individual. But if we think of it in terms of, look, on the outside, you see somebody's behaviors. That's the only thing that we can see, right? We see the behavior in the case of a suicide, right? We see the behavior of somebody's decision to end their own life. But on the inside, they're not operating with the same set of tools that somebody on the outside is looking at them with. So if we think about the depressed mood, right? So the neurochemicals that are there, the idea that I feel no hope about the future, I see there being no options, right? So now not only am I feeling sad and I'm feeling hopeless, which are components of depression, I also got some cognitive restriction. So when we're depressed, we can't problem solve the same way than when we're not depressed. And so people who are on the outside who don't have that cognitive restriction, who don't have that sense of hopelessness and helplessness, are applying those ideas to why would you make that decision to somebody who is looking at the world through a very different lens. Now you sprinkle in the impulsivity that has also been known to be a part of folks who have been diagnosed with CTE. Now you've got that quick minute, second decision that somebody comes up with. Well, I don't see things getting better. I'm terrible. I feel bad. It's never going to change. And then the impulsive decision, let me just end it. And if they use a lethal means, it's sometimes one chance and then it's over.
So on this show, we obviously strive to inform, but we also like to try to help when we can. So I've got a couple questions here for those who may be listening to this and feel like they relate to some of what's going on with them. For someone who may be listening to this, and whether it's them personally or they have a friend or a loved one who was an athlete, is an athlete, maybe dealing with some mental or physical ailments themselves, what are some maybe common signs or symptoms that they could be on the lookout for to kind of acknowledge that, hey, there may be a larger issue here, whether it be physical or mental? I mean, obviously physical is a little easier to kind of spot, like you mentioned, if somebody's limping or they're actively struggling to move around, but there's also a mental component that's not as easy to kind of spot.
Yeah, I think what we want to do is recognize that if and when somebody's had an injury or if they've been dealing with chronic pain associated with injuries earlier in their life, when they're not able to do the things they want to do, that is essentially a threat, right? So somebody's identity has been taken from them in some form or fashion. And that could be the professional athlete who now can't play in the game. It could be the recreational athlete who can't go ski with their friends. And that taking away of part of who I am is something that can be devastating for folks. And so recognizing that when somebody's injured, it's not just physical and there is a mental component is kind of step one with this. And with that, as somebody's not able to do the things and maybe spend time with the people that they want to spend time with, we are likely to see the experience of sadness, loneliness, maybe hopelessness, anger, right? Things that are associated with a potential mood disorder. You also might have anxiety as somebody feels more lonely and not connected. And recognizing that when somebody is dealing with an injury or dealing with chronic pain, doing it alone is the most difficult thing to do. And knowing that if we can connect and we can put people in touch with others that can help them from whether it's a medical perspective, physical therapy, actual therapy, from a psychological perspective, or even just a group of other people who have had injuries and to talk about their shared experience, right? All of those can help somebody not feel so alone while they're dealing with a physical injury, which then can turn into essentially a mental injury, right? Which is that depressive or anxious or fearful psychological thing that happens after the fact. And so I think that's huge, is to recognize if you have something there physically, there is a mental component, and let people know, let's not suffer alone. Let's put a treatment group around you that can support you in all the ways you need. And then let's connect to other people who can experience and connect with your personal sense of loss. And the more that we can do that, the more folks can realize that they're not on their own and they can get support in this journey.
You mentioned too, whether you're, an NBA player or a recreational, skier or anything in between, obviously there's no way to prevent injury from happening, whether it's on the field of play or even just in all walks of life. I mean, there's really no way to prevent injuries or accidents from happening. But that being said, there are things that can be done to help mitigate or make things smoothly as possible when it comes to the treatment. So on that note, are there things that athletes can do, like I said, whether you are playing at the highest level or you're a recreational athlete, are there things that they can be doing to mitigate the risks involved with trauma, whether that be like maybe preventative measures or even treatment immediately after an injury occurs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think the more that somebody is proactive in taking care of their biological health, right? And the biological health, certainly we're going to talk about, like, we've got the mechanical parts of the body, and that's going to include making sure I give myself appropriate rest for those parts of my body that I'm using, right? So rest and recovery are important when it comes to maintaining health from a physical perspective. And if you do enough of that, you can reduce the risk of injury. We also can roll into that biological. What are we doing as far as fueling, right? Am I giving myself the appropriate fuel? Am I getting the balanced diet I need? Different engagement in sport requires different fuel. And so understanding that and appropriately fueling for the type of sport that we're doing is really valuable. And then the same thing can be said on the psychological, right? So there's a biological component to performance, there's a psychological component, and making sure that we are addressing stressors in our life, right? We have seen research that shows if somebody's under more psychological stress, they're actually more likely to have a physical injury. And so we want to be proactive in handling stress. It's not that we can go through life and have no stress. It's what are my coping skills? Who can support me when I'm feeling stressed? What can I do to reduce non-needed stressors in my life? And recognize I have to take care of that. But if I do take care of that and I am not experiencing high levels of stress, I actually have a less chance of the physical injuries happening from sport. And then there's a social component to this too. So not only biological and psychological, but there's a social component and what's happening in my social life. And this is where we see the overlap. If I'm under a lot of distress in my social life because I got a family member who's sick, or let's say I'm having problems in my relationships, that's going to create psychological stress, right? And so we can see how then that psychological stress can make us more likely for an injury. And so what we want to do is we want to be proactive at doing healthy things in all of those aspects of our life. And if we do that, we can reduce the risk. It's never zero, accidents happen, but we try to control what we can control.
Last question, we'll get you out on this one. For any young athlete that may be listening to this, what advice would you give them as far as balancing both their physical and mental well-being, not just now as they're playing as a younger athlete, but as they continue to progress and get older and continue to keep playing their sport?
I think the best thing to do is to think of it in terms of what is my goal, right? What is my goal? If I can remember that my goal is to perform, if I want to perform at my best, then I'm going to need to take certain steps to be able to perform at my best. And when you're young, sometimes things come easier. And that's on a scale for everybody. But for anyone, when we're younger, our bodies do things easier than they do when we're older. And recognizing that if part of my enjoyment in life is just movement, then let me be mindful about the fact that I want to continue to be able to do that. So I need to be proactive in maintaining physical health, mental health. But what are my goals, right? And if I think about goals and about the long term, then I can think about the maintenance for the long term. And the body is the temple, and the more we put into maintenance up front, the better and longer is that journey going to be that we're able to use our bodies in a physical way and really enjoy that physical lifestyle.
All right, Dr. Harlan Austin, thank you so much again for joining me today.
My pleasure.
All right, that'll do it for this edition of the Victory Over Vices podcast. Thank you so much to Dr. Harlan Austin for joining me once again today. If you liked what you heard, if you liked what you saw, please continue to like, subscribe, rate, review. Please also continue to share with your friends, family members, and loved ones. If you're watching us or if you want to watch us, you can do so over on YouTube. For those who want the audio-only experience, you can find us on Spotify and everywhere else you may get your podcast. And as I like to do at the end of every show, I'd like to just take a minute to remind everyone, especially with our topics of conversation today, that if you or a loved one is struggling, please, 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 please go get the professional help that you need. It is okay not to be okay, but also it's important that you seek out professional help so that you can live your life to the fullest. It's as simple as that. And so if you are needing help and you're not sure where to start, please go visit addictionhelp.com. They have great resource pages over there and everything that you may need to learn more about certain ailments, or even to learn about how you can get started seeking out professional help. Because at the end of the day, we want everyone to live a happy life. We want everyone to live a healthy life, and we want everyone to live their life to the fullest. So, but on that note, that will do it for today's episode. Thanks so much once again, to all of you out there for joining me. And we'll chat with you later on the next episode. So have a good one, everybody.